Hi, this is Brock Dickinson, and I'm coming to you today from high above the city of Toronto, overlooking the Toronto Harbor on a cold winter day. I wanted to pick up on a theme that we occasionally visit on the channel around workforce challenges. And a few weeks ago, I released a video looking at how Dubai had built a model for trying to solve workforce shortages. Today, I want to talk a little bit about what Canada has done in that space and the kinds of lessons that we can take away from that. And this is all related to a series of kind of emerging demographic challenges around the world. Although there are parts of the planet that continue to experience population growth, for the first time in human history, overall populations are beginning to decline. And they're declining faster in some areas than others. The poster child for this is, of course, China, where we can expect the population over the course of this century to fall by a half or even 2/3. And the challenge that this creates is often pretty staggering when it comes to economic development thinking. So if, like China, the crux or the basis of your dramatic economic expansion in recent years has been the availability of cheap and relatively skilled labor, and your population starts to fall, this raises a whole bunch of issues. In the Chinese case, the population is first aging and then collapsing on the basis of the demographic realities that we see. And part of what happens is that as the population ages, people age out of the workforce, then later as it begins to decline, it gets smaller and smaller. And that process is paralleled in the size of the workforce itself. So if the population is aging, there aren't enough young people to fill the spaces of retirees leaving the workforce, then that obviously has implications for the size of the workforce. As the population starts to decline, that also has implications for the size of the workforce. And where once in a place like China, labor was abundant and cheap and therefore advantageous for manufacturing and other kinds of operations to locate there, that declining population means that as labor becomes scarce, the law of supply and demand tells us that the cost of that labor goes up and everything made in China gets more expensive. This same process can be seen playing out in a number of places around the world, in places like Germany, in Italy, and in Canada. And Canada has struggled with this reality for a number of years, but the solutions that it has come up with are very different than the kinds of solutions that we looked at in the Dubai case. For Canada, we can see that participation rates in the labor force have actually been declining since 2003. So for more than 20 years, we've seen this kind of growing challenge in the size and shape of the workforce. And the reality is that today, the population that is retiring and leaving the workforce is larger than the population that is available to enter the workforce. And so we see this increasing period of labor shortages emerging. This really came to a fore during the pandemic, when employers began to really struggle to find available workers. And there were a few things going on here. One is that, the grumpy old guys kind of have an initial reaction to this, that this is all about, hey, lazy young kids, those millennials, those Gen Zs, they don't want to work. Gen Zs, for my American friends, they don't want to work. They don't want to do this stuff. And so we looked at the data to kind of find out what was happening here, and it turns out that no, that's not the case at all. We have this kind of image of young people living in their parents' basements playing video games and not wanting to work. But in fact, in the Canadian case, the participation rates of those aged 15 to 24 and 24 to 54 are larger, higher than they have been at any point in the history of the Canadian workforce. And so young people are not avoiding the workforce. They're not trying to avoid work. They're just simply not available in the workforce. There are too few of them. And so one of the things that we saw during the pandemic as things began to shut down is that the scarcity of labor leads to that notion that wages begin to rise. But as workers recognize that their skills are in demand, it's not just that they can earn more, it's that they can be more selective about the kinds of jobs that they want to take. And so one of the things that the Canadian economy experienced was this kind of massive shift in the location of workers, that people left low-paying industries like the tourism sector or the hospitality sector, the food and beverage service sector, and they moved into higher paying occupations things like information technology, like government service, like the financial services sector, because their skills were so valuable, just their mere presence was necessary in many cases, they were able to trade low-paying jobs for high-paying jobs. And one of the implications of that was that in literally every sector of the Canadian economy over the last 5 or 6 years, the cost of labor has risen. So wage rates have risen in every single sector of the Canadian economy, with the exception of mining and oil and gas. But in every other sector of the economy, wage rates have gone up because employers have to compete for that small supply of available labor. Now, this creates real challenges because it means the costs of operating a business in that environment continue to climb, and it gets more and more difficult to remain competitive with employers, manufacturers, businesses, operators in other jurisdictions when your own labor costs are kind of spiraling out of control. This was one of the things that drove high levels of inflation in Canada in the COVID and post-COVID period, but continues to be a problem as that sort of shortage of skilled workers creates issues for companies all across the country. So what was the Canadian solution to that challenge? Well, basically it was to open the faucet on immigration and to say, if we're not producing enough young Canadians, that birth rates are falling, demographics are declining, we've got to sort of find an external solution. Now, Canada has always been a nation built on immigration. But what we've seen in the last few years is this kind of fundamental rethink of that model to dramatically open the gates to come to Canada and to really try to use immigration as a way of shoring up this demographic shortage. And so we saw the Liberal government of Justin Trudeau, for example, putting in place systems that would allow at least 500,000 newcomers, immigrants, to come to Canada every single year for multiple years. And in fact, when we started to add in things like temporary foreign workers, international students, family reunification policies, and these sorts of things, we were getting to the point that it was 1 million plus newcomers coming to Canada every year. And this did seem to have some pretty positive impacts on talent availability in the workforce, but it brought with it a series of other challenges as well. It's difficult to accommodate and find places for and sort of integrate that many newcomers into a country all at once. And while Canada has always been the most pro-immigration country on the face of the planet, this level of immigration seemed to kind of create a bit of a backlash, maybe for the first time in reading recent Canadian history. A colleague once said to me, well, when you start to notice immigration, that's when you know you may have some social issues arising out of the levels of immigration that you have. And this is part of what was happening and drove a reversal of immigration policy in Canadian politics. So Canada in the last few months has gone from the most open immigration system, trying to kind of use immigration to solve this workforce development challenge, to a system that is increasingly closed, and this is now causing problems in the other direction for many employers across the country. So I would say that part of what we have discovered in the Canadian context is that yes, high levels of immigration do seem to have a positive impact on workforce challenges. There are some integration issues. There are some challenges around recognition of foreign credentials and these sorts of things. And interestingly, in the Canadian context, it wasn't just large cities that benefited from this wave of immigration, but smaller and mid-sized cities as well. But alongside those workforce benefits, there were a whole host of other challenges that came in terms of integrating those newcomers into the communities that they were joining, but also in looking at some of the other economic issues that were caused by the rapid arrival of large numbers of people into places that weren't well prepared for that at the infrastructure level. Canada was already facing a housing shortage, sort of coming into this period of very high immigration. And there's some suggestion that the millions of additional Canadians, newcomers, the new Canadians that came in, were sort of exacerbating elements of that housing shortage. That's a very controversial issue, and I'm going out on a bit of a limb to sort of suggest that. But part of what we see here is theories from economists like the Georgists that suggest that very small changes in demand for accommodations or for housing-oriented real estate can have outsized impacts on the pricing of that real estate. And so as Canada developed a housing shortage and embraced a new wave of newcomers and immigrants coming into the country, that this exacerbated the housing situation and drove real estate prices up quite dramatically in a way that that the country has not yet been able to recover from, and now sort of faces a bit of a housing crisis. And so there's some mixed messages that come out of this Canadian approach to trying to solve the workforce development challenge. Interestingly, many other countries have said they want to try the Canadian approach. Australia has said this, the UK has said this, German business groups have been sort of advocating or pushing for this. But the true story of what's happened in Canada may be a little bit more mixed in terms of its actual implications. It's a bit like a pendulum in a sense that the floodgates were opened up on the immigration side. We've now sort of shut them down in a completely different direction because of the implications for housing and other issues. There's a struggle to kind of find that happy medium that meets the needs of both workforce development and the broader economy. And I will say that at least Canada is experimenting with these kinds of ideas and looking for potential solutions in the mix here. And perhaps that's where one of the key lessons lies.